We're moving on to our second theoretical paradigm. This course is different than my development of sociological theory course because in my development of sociological theory course there's only 5 theorists. And in this course there's like 500. Not really 500 theorists, but there's a lot of theorists that we cover. The silver lining to covering a lot of theorists in a quarter is that if you don't like a particular theoretical paradigm, or you don't like a theorist and the argument that the theorist is providing, of course, you don't have that much time to spend with them before we move on to another theoretical paradigm. Can you imagine spending 3 to 4 weeks on structural functionalism? How exhausting that would be. So only a week with Parsons and Merton, and then we move on, right? So now we're going to be discussing critical theory, which is quite different, as you will see, from structural functionalism. So we have these 3 theorists. Ideally, we'll see what we can do here. Ideally, it'd be nice to get through the work of all 3 theorists today, although that's being a little too optimistic, because there's a lot to unpack with this first wave, or the first school, so to speak, of the Frankfurt School theorists. There are, in fact, 3 generations of Frankfurt School theorists. So we're going to be starting with the first generation of Frankfurt School theorists, which include, but are not limited to, the following theorists: Max Horkheimer and Theodor Adorno and Herbert Marcuse. Another first generation Frankfurt School theorist, maybe a name that rings the bell, would be Erich Fromm. Erich Fromm is also part of this first generation of Frankfurt School theorists. Thursday, we'll get to the work of Jürgen Habermas. And Jürgen Habermas was a student of this first generation of Frankfurt School theorists. In fact, Jürgen Habermas was Theodor Adorno's research assistant. But Habermas's work departs in important ways from the first generation of Frankfurt School theorists. So again, today, let's just focus on the work of these 3 theorists. These are 3 leading exponents of critical theory, which, yes, is connected to conflict theory. So in a standard introductory to sociology textbook, you'll have a couple pages on functionalism and a couple pages on symbolic interactionism and a couple pages on conflict theory. So the critical theorists fall within that school of thought, conflict theorists. So why are these theorists and subsequent generations of theorists referred to as Frankfurt School theorists? It has to do with their affiliation. It has to do with an institutional affiliation to the Institute for Social Research, which is based in Frankfurt, Germany. Hence the moniker, the Frankfurt School theorists. The Frankfurt School theorists. One of the most important developments in 20th century Marxism has been the critical theory of the Frankfurt School. So these are, but it's a point that we have to stress. I think that there's this, so all of these theorists are Marxists. Well, Marx is they're drawing some of ideas, they're deriving a number of ideas from Marx, but they're also deriving ideas from Max Weber, as we'll talk about in a few minutes, and also from Sigmund Freud as well. Probably it was Marcuse who drew most heavily on the work of Sigmund Freud and his theory of repression, right? So it's important to note that while they are deriving ideas from Marx, their theory also departs in important ways from the work of Marx. And they supplement their critique by drawing on ideas from Weber and from Freud as well. So they're something of synthesizers. However, a history of dramatic, often shocking changes separates Marx and the Frankfurt School. So there are ideas, again, that they share with Marx, but there are important differences that exist in the work of the Frankfurt School theorists and that of Karl Marx. Ultimately, as our textbook informs us, the Frankfurt School theorists inhabited a different world. They inhabited a different historical period. Consequently, their lived experiences are very different. The world that Marx inhabited, his faith in science and in reason, Marx was ever a believer in Enlightenment ideals, and that science and reason would emancipate us, right? Would save us from the ills of the modern world. Frankfurt School theorists, again, experienced a very different world than Karl Marx experienced prior. The Marxist dream of the coming of a new age of freedom came crashing down with the Nazi and Soviet nightmare of social barbarism and mass terror. Right? So these theorists then are experiencing firsthand two different manifestations of totalitarianism. As you'll see, what is it that preoccupies the interest more than anything else of the Frankfurt School theorists? It's the phenomenon of mass social control. And both the Nazi regime and the Third Reich, fascism, and Soviet, Stalin, communism, these are two iterations or types of totalitarianism. And what do all forms of totalitarianism have in common? They're regimes of mass social control. It's all about obedience, conformity, and if you don't conform and you don't obey, you're sent to a labor camp to die. So both of these regimes, Stalin's style of communism, that's totalitarianism. That's total control. The government controls all aspects of an individual's lives. Fascism is also a form of political social control that aims to create complete obedience to the state. The founding members of the Frankfurt School came of age in the midst of the Great Depression, the rise of Nazism, and the disillusionment with Soviet communism, which couldn't have been farther away from what Marx and Engels envisioned when they first theorized about a classless society. The idea is in a classless society, class struggle would end because labor exploitation would end once there's the collectivization of the means of production. The basic idea is that everybody in the community owns in part the means of production, and consequently there are no classes and there's no way in which the property class can exploit the unproperty class for their own advantage. So the utopian vision of Marx and Engels was you abolish a system of private property that has historically enabled one class, the ruling class, to exploit the unproperty class. The history of all hitherto existing societies is a history of class struggle, right? Because of private property and the ways in which wage laborers or laborers are being exploited by those who own the means of production, right? But ends up there is Soviet collectivization, but that ends in disaster and complete ruin. Right? Peasants are not just willing to give over their land and give over their livestock and give over their other resources. So what does Stalin do to them? Kills them all, or has them arrested and sent to labor camps to die. That's part of the story of Soviet collectivization of the peasants' means of production or ownership of property. So we really have the failure to realize in any substantive way the utopian vision of Marx and Engels. It ends with totalitarianism. And then ultimately, we see the collapse, right, in 1989, the Berlin Wall comes down, and then ultimately the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991. And one of the major reasons why Soviet communism collapsed is because of economic inefficiency. It became an entirely inefficient system of production, distribution, and exchange, certainly compared to capitalism. Therefore, the critical theorists developed a framework that at once extends and in important ways departs from central Marxist ideas. So it would be problematic to simply say this first generation of Frankfurt School theorists are Marxists and just sort of blindly follow the ideology of Marxism. No, they adopt certain ideas of Marx and Engels, but they're also very critical of other ideas, such that the working class is going to save us, say, from human exploitation and oppression. They no longer believe, as Marx and Engels believe, that it's the proletariat worker revolution that's going to lead to a freer, emancipated society. Because it was also those same workers, those same proletarians that played an important role in establishing fascist regimes and totalitarian regimes, say, under Stalin. What did they inherit? What can we clearly say these Frankfurt School theorists inherited from Marx and Engels? Well, they certainly inherited Marx's basic conception of society, which is the following, which is to say, this is conflict theory proper. This is a type of conception of society or worldview understood by conflict theorists. And it goes something like this. Human society is composed of individuals and groups that compete over scarce and valued resources. It's to appreciate human society as a site of human conflict, of struggle. And this, again, goes back to the most famous statement ever penned by Marx and Engels. The history of all hitherto existing societies is a history of class struggle. All of human history has been struggle. Struggle between individuals and groups. Struggle over what for the Marxists? Over control of the means of production. Control over productive activity. And why is it so important that a group controls productive activity? Because if you control productive activity, then you can control the distribution of the rewards of the productive process. Meaning if you're a CEO, you get to decide how much you get paid. You get to decide how much profit you get to keep from productive activity that comes from your firm, corporation, or organization. The basic understanding of human society that centers competition, right in the center. And we can explain a lot of problems that we see in today's world as a result of competition. Competition between groups. Competition over control of wealth, status, and power. So this is part, as Freud would say, this is part of our constitution, and particularly as primates. And we look at all the primates, and we're one of many types of primates in the animal kingdom, and they all do the same thing. They compete with one another, they fight with one another, they kill one another for control over scarce and desired resources. For the chimpanzee, it's fighting to control territory and fruit trees, which of course is a resource that maintains life itself. So we would say, or the conflict theorists would say, human beings struggle over the following. We of course will fight with one another over all sorts of other things, but centrally wealth, status, and power. Control over the means of production will largely determine who gets what in terms of wealth. Status, there's competition in terms of status, and there's competition in terms of power. That is to say, who has legitimate authority to make decisions and make those decisions binding, so that people have to follow those rules. Right? The question of power has to do with authority. And authority is the right to issue commands and see that those commands are followed by subordinates. So power is really the realm of control. Power is the realm of influence. I get to say what you're going to do. That's power. So for the critical theorist, who is also the conflict theorist, social institutions, cultural systems, and social groups. Remember during week 1 I said, well, sociology is the study of society, but what's that first? Where does that first analytical step take us when we start to break society down into its component parts? We have institutions, we have cultural systems, and we have social groups. So those three things are to be analyzed, according to the critical theorist, in terms of power, domination, social control. In the Frankfurt School, theorists were obsessed with social control, the forms of social control that permeate society, and the ways in which social control, the dynamics of social control, have changed over time. Different eras, different epochs are characterized by different systems of social control. And so their preoccupation or their fixation is on how does social control manifest itself today? How does it operate today? We can look historically at forms of social control, but a lot of those forms of social control are antiquated. They're outdated. They don't exist anymore. They're too cumbersome. They're too messy. They're too sloppy. They cause too much pushback. It sows the seeds of resistance. So today's forms of social control, the Frankfurt School theorists argue, are much more subtle. It's likely that you won't even identify those forms of social control as forms of social control. That's when you know a system of domination is working. You don't even know it exists. It doesn't exist to you because it's so nicely woven into the fabric of society. What do you mean this is controlling me? I thought this is how I wanted to live my life. Well, that's ideological domination and hegemony, where your interests and the interests of those that control you are symbiotic. You go, oh, but I want to shop all day, and I want to spend my whole life on my cell phone. Isn't that the best way to live? There are powerful vested interests in seeing that you spend as much time as possible on your cell phone. The centrality of conflict, again, coming from the Communist Manifesto, the history of all hitherto existing society is the history of class struggle. So to contrast this with last week's conversation, last week the focus is on what is it that conserves societies for the functionalists? What conserves societies? What preserves societies? And critical theorists, of course, are focused on conflict. However, so that's one way in which you may be asking, well, in what ways are the Frankfurt School theorists similar to Marx and Engels? Well, they inherit a particular worldview, a certain understanding of human society, society as a competition. Individuals and groups compete with one another. Always a competition. In our society, in particular, competition is one mechanism that determines who gets what and why. At the end of the NFL season, we have the playoffs happening right now in Major League Baseball. We'll see how that plays out for the Dodgers, right? at the end, ultimately, who's the victor? Who is the champion? Who is the national champion? That will be decided through a course of competitive play. So at the end of October, we will have a victor, and that victor has the claims the rightful status as national champion precisely because they went through a process, they participated in a process of competition. So in our society, competition is an important mechanism that determines who gets what and why. Well, who gets the rightful claim to national champion? The team that wins the most games during playoffs. And so they say our title was rightfully achieved through the competitive process. However, critical theorists largely abandoned analyses of economic conditions. They turned away from Marx's doctrine of historical materialism to better focus their analysis of culture and analogy, to better focus their analysis probably on culture, I should probably say on culture and ideology. So what becomes more important to these Frankfurt School theorists is the way in which the superstructure, right, ideology, is used by the ruling class in order to manipulate the consciousness of individuals. So it's really now that's not to say that they don't talk about, they'll continue to critique capitalism, and they'll continue to critique ownership of the means of production. They're very much aware that the ruling class is the ruling class because of the process of labor exploitation in which the lion's share of rewards from productive activity is then owned and possessed by them. They get all that, but they're directing their attention to an analysis of how does, say, indoctrination work today in our society, right? They're fascinated as that's one mechanism, right? That's one way in which you can control human behavior. You control human behavior by controlling consciousness. And you can control consciousness through the process of indoctrination. And indoctrination means, and it's a strong word, and it means the uncritical acceptance of. So a person can say that they're indoctrinated if they've uncritically accepted something as the truth. Now, if they arrive at that truth after a process of critique and analysis, well, then that's actually not indoctrination. Indoctrination, again, involves the uncritical acceptance of something. It means it's just assumed to be true. And it's not questioned. So they focus their attention then on the phenomena of ideological control and on the irrationality of reason. So this is where we get to some Weberian analysis. And the importance of Weberian analysis is the process of rationalization. The process of rationalization. We live in an ever-increasing bureaucratic world where we're expected to be good rule followers. They say, well, why do that? Well, because it stipulates here in this particular bylaw that you're supposed to follow that rule. Okay, don't ask questions, just follow the rules. Right? Again, why is it that they've shifted their attention away? Because for Marx and Engels, superstructure is just, it's secondary, right? You know this from taking 101. There's the base and there's superstructure. And the base is ultimately the mode of production, and in the mode of production you have the means of relations of production, the means of production, the forces of production, all that sort of stuff. And superstructure is simply a mirror. It simply mirrors the interests of the ruling class, and those are the people that own the means of production, right? So the Frankfurt School of Theorists argue that the changing economic circumstances alone are incapable of mechanically transforming the consciousness of the working class. With the rise of totalitarianism, they no longer cast the working class in the role of savior of humanity. Because at this point, they've already seen the rise of fascism, and they've seen the rise of Soviet totalitarianism. And they say the working class is not going to save us. The working class participated in the rise of those regimes of totalitarianism. Marx's critique of ideological power was of most significance in shaping their theoretical framework. In his great polemic, The German Ideology, which I just discussed on Thursday in my 101 class, Marx argues that the prevailing ideologies and cultural norms of any society serve to benefit the ruling classes and perpetuate their power. That's the central insight. That's what superstructure does. That superstructure is always used as a meaning, that is to say, ideology, in the form of law, in the form of morality. That superstructure is always used, ideas are always used by those in power to justify and naturalize their position of power. That's how Marx and Engels understood ideology. Ideology is inherently biased. All ideologies are self-serving. So they'd see, who is it that the ruling class has the resources to hire ideologues? And the ideologues produce the propaganda that is self-serving. Right? And that's our very definition of what propaganda is. Propaganda is any information that is intentionally one-sided. They're not telling you the whole truth because they don't want you to know the whole truth. They only want you to know one side of it. And that one side is which, again, justifies the interests of the ruling class. So the best way to end the spread of propaganda is to always analyze things in terms of the pros and the cons, the strengths and the weaknesses. And that's the type to avoid the pitfalls and the traps of this type of thinking. Analysis needs to be biased. So if we're at, it's one of the great failures of Marxian theory. I mean, we haven't reached the end of human history yet, so we'll see what ends. The experiment continues. Right? Who knows where we're going to be in 100 years, 500 years, 1,000 years, or 10,000 years? I don't know what sort of economic system we're going to have. But Marx and Engels predicted the collapse of capitalism, basically within their lifetime. That did not happen. We saw the steady rise of capitalism. We also saw the rise of communism, but then we saw the fall of communism and now the spread of global capitalism. So it's quite contrary to their prophecy, which they believed they would see the end of it. Now, why were they so off? And students ask me this all the time. Why did they get it so wrong? Because in their critique and analysis of capitalism, all they did is pay attention to the weaknesses of capitalism, but never took time to consider the strengths of this economic system. So, learning from the mistakes of these geniuses is don't be so biased in your analysis. Had they paid more attention to the strengths of capitalism, they probably wouldn't have predicted its collapse. They would have said, oh, that's one of the most adaptive economic systems ever created. And because that adaptability is why it's going to survive. So, a little tangent, but that's okay. Superstructure, again, is the term that Marx and Engels use. Superstructure reflects the ruling class. So it's a very simple idea. Again, just simply, if you want to use the word bias, right? That ideologies are profoundly biased and they're profoundly self-serving. Antonio Gramsci was among the first neo-Marxists to update and rework this thesis. During the reign of Mussolini's fascist Italy, Gramsci recognized the ideological power of culture as an effective means of social control. And he means by that also popular culture, the way in which cinema was being used by Mussolini. Hitler learned a lot from Mussolini. People often think that Mussolini was sort of secondary. Hitler learned so much from Mussolini. And the way in which Mussolini was able to harness the power of cinema and mass media to, again, the word would be that they would use to indoctrinate the masses. Right? So the power of culture, and we would say today, the power of popular culture, say billboards or magazines or newspapers, or cinema and movies and films and all the ways in which you can better transform the consciousness of individuals through the dissemination of that messaging through popular cultural channels. So the term that Gramsci coined is called cultural hegemony. Cultural hegemony, the word hegemony just simply means dominance. So cultural hegemony means cultural dominance. That at different periods of time in different societies, different ideologies are more dominant. They have greater hegemonic status. So they're more salient than, say, ideas or beliefs or norms or whatever in different societies. So in modern times, societies may be even more seamlessly controlled through the dissemination of mass media by engineering popular consensus through the power of persuasion. The power of persuasion. And persuasion is a particular type of social influence. If you haven't taken a social psychology class, I would encourage you to do so. The social psychologist, that subfield of both psychology and sociology, emerged in response to the deliberate study of the phenomenon of social influence. Right? Persuasion is one form of social influence. There are many types of social influence. Compliance is one form. Conformity is one form. Obedience is one form. Persuasion is an important form of social influence, that you are able to change somebody's mind. You can change their attitude. You can change their opinion on something. So the idea is that, or maybe you find yourself you're not looking to buy a new car, but you find yourself at a car lot just browsing around, and you're approached by a salesperson. And before you know it, the salesperson has persuaded you to buy a new car. They've changed your mind about saying, "Oh, I don't need a new car." Well, hey, have you seen the features on this new one? And they change your mind. And the idea is for the social psychologist, if you change someone's mind, you can then change their behavior. So mass media serve to disseminate propaganda is what Gramsci argued. Yet while Marx unmasked ideological biases, his critical attitude toward Western industrial societies did not extend to his faith in science and its power to liberate humanity. What that means is Marx remained, throughout his lifetime, a staunch believer in the ideals of the Enlightenment, particularly the power of reason and the power of science. Marx saw himself as a scientist. He believed, along with Engels, that they had made a monumental discovery, just in the way that Darwin had discovered the process of natural selection. Of course, we can explain the evolution of species today, both in terms of natural selection and also in terms of genetic mutation, which that would later follow. After Darwin passes, we would learn more about genetic mutation, and now to the point where we can, through CRISPR technology, we can just modify people's genes. We can edit people's genes. So Marx and Engels thought that this discovery of a theory of historical materialism was really on par with Darwin's discovery of natural selection and evolution. That this whole time, human conflict centered on one thing, and only one thing, and that's control over the means of production. And if we simply collectivize ownership over productive activity, we can eliminate human conflict. So Marx was certainly a captive of the Enlightenment faith that science, that reason can reveal truths that are liberating. So science is on our side. science is going to help us harness our own potential as a species and can serve us to make our lives better. Okay, now what about, that's Marx's orientation, that's Marx's view before the crushing realities of two totalitarian systems, of fascism, of Soviet-style communism, before reason and science were co-opted as instruments of social control. In contrast, faced with what they considered to be the irrationality of the modern world, the Frankfurt School theorists abandoned the Enlightenment dream that reason and science could help to liberate humanity. So by this point, they're saying, are you kidding me? I mean, reason, this is Weberian, right? This is Weber, again, makes this argument. This is the administrative society, total administration. The power has gotten so, the exercise of mass control is so well orchestrated that the subjects of that social control don't even see that they're subjects of social control. It's all the way, they would love this stuff. They'd love this technology. They wouldn't really love it, but they would love to critique it. All the ways in which the algorithms are designed and developed to manipulate human consciousness. And the whole time you're just like, this is so much fun. I can't get enough of this. That's what they mean. That's total domination. You want to do it, and they want you to do it. Reason and science had become tools of oppression. So there are those that are critical of Silicon Valley and the technologies that are produced by Silicon Valley. Ironically, a lot of them are, defectors from within. As we hear these debates about AI and how should AI be used, and there are those who are saying that AI is being used to control people as opposed to liberate people. It's not being used in the service of the public good, it's being used in the pursuit of profit. And there's a lawsuit, evidently, that's going on between Elon Musk and other founders of AI, and Elon Musk is saying, we're deviating from the original mission of AI, which was supposed to be, it's good for people, it's supposed to serve the public good. So the Frankfurt School of Theorists, in other words, they have a very, very, very cynical view of reason and science. Reason and science have become now, today, instruments of control and instruments of domination. Right? You go back to the Enlightenment age and you think of Immanuel Kant. And Immanuel Kant says, dare to know, that was his mantra. Dare to know, dare to question authority. And it's through the use of our intellect, of reason, that we can improve our condition. At this point, they're saying we're the mid-20th century here, they're saying reason is just another resource. Science is just another resource that's used by those in control to better enhance the control that they have over people. So it's a very cynical view of reason and science, and one that Marx himself did not subscribe to because he did not witness those historical atrocities that the first generation of the Frankfurt School witnessed. So Marx was cynical, but not as hyper-cynical as the first generation of Frankfurt School theory. I mean, this is a very pessimistic group, folks. This is a very pessimistic group of individuals. Max Weber, back to the importance of it, because it's not just Marxian ideas that are informing the work of the Frankfurt School. It's Weber has made many very important contributions to help analysts critique how power operates in a society. So Weber warned of a perpetually expanding rationalized society dictated by formal rationality, what he called formal rationality, rationality by rules, rule following. All bureaucracies are predicated on the existence of rules, and any person in a position of power, of course, has that power because they can point to a set of established rules that say, I'm in this position of power precisely because the rules that justify this position of authority that I'm in. Just as our entire society, you can look at the U.S. Constitution, right? In the Bill of Rights, the Declaration of Independence, there's 3 political documents that provide the foundation for our republic. What are those? What's the essence of those documents? Rules. Rules. That's what is the essence of the Constitution. And of course, we have various amendments and ways in which we can change these rules, but it has to go through a procedure, a process by which those amendments can occur and be ratified. But it's the rule-following agents in a society, formal rationality. This instrumental worldview has ushered in an increasingly impersonal and bureaucratic society. Weber told us that the modern era is one of technological rationality. It was not the exploitation inherent in capitalism that was responsible for the oppression of humanity. That was Marx's view, but not Weber's view. For Weber, it was rather the forms of thought, and in particular, the totalitarianism of reason and rationality. In fact, Weber defended capitalism, although the modern form, what was the modern form at his age, certainly gave him pause. He was perplexed by it, he was concerned by it, but he believed that capitalism, compared to other economic systems, actually provided individuals such as entrepreneurs greater personal freedom and consumers, right? The idea that capitalism is consumers, and it's, in theory, ideally, it's the consumers and the choices that consumers make that shape and that steer the direction of commerce. So for Weber, even defended capitalism compared to other economic systems, such as a command system in which those that are in positions, the administrators that run the economy, they make the decisions for the consumers. And they say how much of what should be produced and what are the goods that should be produced, and it's a top-down command system, right? And that involves, of course, a tremendous amount of social control. The obstacles to realizing perfected social order lie in distorted consciousness. So this becomes then the primary interest, the ways in which our consciousness is intentionally being manipulated and being distorted by individuals and groups that are in power. And this goes hand in hand, they would say, with ever-evolving technologies in a society. I mean, look at our digital ecosystem. You know, we all live in this digital ecosystem. They would look at that digital ecosystem with a critical eye, right? Cynically. How is this digital ecosystem leading to you having distorted consciousness? How is your constant exposure to content that flows through Instagram, that flows through TikTok, how is it distorting your consciousness? And making you believe that some things are important that in reality aren't important at all. They just become important because it's a fabricated environment. The critical theorists located the source of distorted consciousness in the irrationality of rationality. There are particular forms of rationality that they argue sustain human oppression. This is the ways in which science and reason can be used to better control the minds of individuals. That's it. Sort of put it in everyday parlance, in everyday language. That's really what they're fascinated by. The ways in which modern day technologies of their time and even popular culture, because Horkheimer and Adorno wrote The Dialectic of Enlightenment, and they were critiquing the culture industry. They were living in Los Angeles, actually Pacific Palisades at the time that they wrote that book back in 1944, The Dialectic of Enlightenment. And they were critical of the ways in which popular culture is being used to manipulate the consciousness of individuals. So reason itself, back to an important point when trying to grasp the state of mind of the Frankfurt School of Theory, reason itself had become corrupted, leaving individuals unable to negate or develop a critique of objective truth to resist domination. Fun with domination. The idea is that we're so totally immersed into it that we don't even see the ways in which we're being manipulated. That's how they would look at us. I can't wait to get my new iPhone. Oh, this is what I'm so excited. And you'd say it's a more advanced phone. They'd say, well, yeah, it's more advanced. It's so advanced that there are all these other ways in which it can manipulate your consciousness. But you can't wait to have it. Formal rationality, and sorry for the jargon, there's no way around it. We'll just a couple slides here, and hopefully we can get beyond the jargon. We can't. Again, language is all we have as sociologists. It's the only thing we make. It's the only thing we produce. We produce ideas, and those ideas boil down to concepts. Right? Formal rationality is forged its own worldview. Subjective versus objective reason. Technological versus individualistic rationality. It can be confusing because each theorist coins their own terms and defines their own terms accordingly. It's not necessarily the case that they're even using the same terms in the same way. So again, it's okay. You don't really need to know the subtle differences between the theorists or the ways exactly which Horkheimer uses this term compared or vis-a-vis with Marcuse compared to Adorno, etc. For our purposes, it's just getting a sense as to their worldview. Again, what is the problem that they're analyzing? Subjective reason, technological rationality are primarily concerned with procedural efficiency. As such, they are largely divorced from ethics and value judgments, not oriented to answer the question why. So that's what they would like to see us. They would like to see us. What concerns Frankfurt School theorists is they would say, and now this is also, keep in mind, this is the 1940s and later in the 1950s, and that really was an era marked by a heightened degree of conformity in society. I don't know what their critique would look like exactly in today's world, because today, in our society, and you also have, and this is the other side of technology, is you have technological means now in which you can voice criticisms of those in positions of power and those who occupy the institutions of great influence. But they would say at the time of the 40s and 50s that American society follows the dictates of efficiency, convenience, and profit. Technology and science had reneged on their promise to usher in a just and reasonable world. So more on their cynicism, the loss of faith in science and reason. Well, science and reason, we could have used them. We could have harnessed their potential for enhancing the public good. We could have used them, say, not in the service of domination, but in the service of liberation. But Freud would say this is the nature of the species. This is the nature of the species. Eros and Thanatos, always at odds. Internally, we have the two instinctual drives, the one of love and the one of aggression. And as a species, it expresses itself as well in terms of bonds of love and bonds of aggression, or acts of aggression. Modern society continues to be plagued by inequality, oppression, destruction, and poverty. Further, they point out, technological advances have produced ever more lethal and destructive weapons. So for students who say, well, in what way is science being used to do harm? Well, through producing ever more lethal and destructive weapons, say such as around this time the creation of the atomic bomb. And then after this time, of course, more and more the arsenal of nuclear weapons continues to grow. And this will forever, as long as we have nuclear weapons in circulation or in existence, this will always be an existential threat for our species. The root of the inhumanity of the modern condition was not a lack of economic and scientific development. Rather, their argument is it's a consequence. I mean, the crises that we face today, consider again the threat of nuclear war. That's not a threat. That's the result of the lack of scientific development. That's precisely because of scientific development. In what ways are we using reason and science that harm human beings as opposed to help them? Rather, they point out that it was the result of technological or instrumental rationality coming to form the basis of the dominant ideology. They say the ideology becomes common sense, becomes taken for granted. Of course, we have an arms race. There are those military sociologists, and again, this is another one of these hypotheses that time will tell. We haven't had a world war since 1945. We've had a Cold War. It's called Cold War as opposed to hot war because it was more of an ideological struggle between the East and the West. There are those that would argue, though, we haven't had World War III precisely because of the existence of nuclear weapons. And nuclear weapons are preventing major nuclear powers from going to war with one another, right? So those powers were really engaged as the U.S. had, and the U.S. has plenty of nuclear weapons, engaged in wars, say Iraq War, Afghanistan War, other wars, Vietnam Wars, right? But those were against nation states that were non-nuclear. Some argue that the distribution of nuclear arms to all nation states will prevent any nation state from attacking another nation state out of the fear of triggering a nuclear war. But that is a theory. There are different theories that are proposed to account for why have we not seen a World War III. But I mean, it's just, frankly, it's just a matter of time. I think we all know that. It's a matter of time. As Freud would say, the human species is endowed with a great degree of aggressivity. It's part of our nature to be aggressive, particularly as primates. Primates are particularly aggressive. We rank very high. I provide this information in my social psychology class. When looking at species that commit the most homicides, like we're right there. The meerkat, I think, is the only living thing above the primate that kills more of its own. So Freud might say, well, there are genetic or biological reasons for our aggressivity and why we've utilized reason and science in the service of human aggression. Freud would say that's because we're an aggressive species. That's what we do. We're aggressive. We compete with one another. There's lots of resources that could be shared. We're just not particularly good at sharing. People don't want to share. People hoard. Most primates hoard. Far from leading to progress in the emancipation of humanity, science, which during Marx's era and for the Age of Enlightenment, that was to be our savior, was leading civilization into a new kind of barbarism. Annihilation of the race. Because of our intellectual and cognitive abilities to engage in reason and the use of the scientific method for replicability. New forms of technocratic domination then emerged. Frankfurt School theorists developed a critical social philosophy that attacked scientific enterprise Foucault, we'll get to Foucault in a few weeks. Foucault was also very influenced by the work of the Frankfurt School theorists, and also adopted a similar posture and point of view. And part of his project was to show how very biased science is. Okay, of the greatest concern for these critical theorists was the loss of individual freedom. Again, you can really, to get your head around it, what is the phenomenon they are most interested in explaining? And, they're neurotic for sure. They're fixated on this. It's the fear of conformity. It's the fear of mass social control. And they feel, when they look around, that there aren't enough people equally preoccupied with this anxiety of theirs. Like, why isn't it anybody else? Why aren't these alarms sounding? Why? That's what they're when they're looking at American society and thinking, why is nobody else concerned or perplexed by this? So Horkheimer uses the term imitation, uses the term strict conformity, complete assimilation, and the decline of the individual. People's minds are closed to dreams of a basically different world, dwindling away of individual thinking. So more and more people are just swept away by the currents of conformity. That you're a neurotic if you don't want to participate in social media. You're a neurotic if you don't want the new phone or feel that it's associated with forms of manipulation. Of the manipulation of consciousness. People say, what's wrong with you? Yeah, that sounds like a you problem. Okay, so let's talk about dialectic of enlightenment, because this is, again, provides us with a nice way of getting at the critique that they're levying through their analysis of the culture industry. So dialectic of enlightenment, I may have this I think I have this in the next slide or two. Dialectic means an opposition of forces. It's a term that goes all the way, you can trace the concept all the way back to antiquity. I think it was really popularized, though, in the work of George Hegel, which influenced the ideas of Karl Marx. Karl Marx used the term dialectic, and of course, Frankfurt School theorists use it. Dialectic, there's an opposition of forces. The Enlightenment, again, the ideals of the Enlightenment. The ideals of the Enlightenment would be liberty, right? Personal freedom, equality, whatever it might be, right? And the ways in which these values have been subsequently undermined, through the emergence of forms of popular culture that don't encourage people to think for themselves, but rather encourage people to conform, to go along. So the treatise offers a scathing critique of the nature and the effects of what they call the culture industry. The culture industry. So I'll take a few slides to set up what the culture industry refers to, and then we want to get at what is the critique of the nature and the effects of the culture industry. So they have two things to say as to the nature of the culture industry, and then one very damning critique of the effect, an important effect of the culture industry. What they say is the result of prolonged exposure to the content of the culture industry, meaning what this prolonged exposure to the following do to one's mind. So this is the culture. What the culture industry, what is it? What composes the culture industry? Well, they would say television, film, radio, popular music, magazines, newspapers, books, and let's not leave out advertisements, and the advertisements that sell these commodities. Okay, here's that slide to help you better understand them. Because it is It's a great title. It's a great title. The Dialectic of the Enlightenment. There's good reason why this book is titled The Dialectic of the Enlightenment. The Enlightenment itself refers to a European intellectual movement that emphasized reason over tradition and science over superstition. As I was saying earlier, Immanuel Kant's mantra was dare to know, dare to question tradition, dare to use one's faculties, to use one's power of reason to critique, to analyze. Right? The idea is that if you analyze something enough, you'll get to the essence of it. That is to say, you'll get to the truth of it. But you would have to have, of course, first the courage to question traditions, to question realities. The promise of the Age of Reason, the Age of Reason refers to that period of time in European society, the 17th and 18th centuries, was to cultivate, the idea is to cultivate a society of free thinkers, to encourage individuals to think for themselves, as opposed to simply blindly following tradition. However, Horkheimer and Adorno tell us that modernity is distinguished by the absence. This is why it's a dialectic. It's the opposite. And so they focus their attention, their criticism on the culture industry and how they believe the culture industry, through the production of these popular cultural commodities, leads to the diminishment of free thought and the diminishment of free thinkers. So modernity, it's the opposite. It's the opposite. The age of enlightenment, we were supposed to be freed. We're all supposed to be, to optimize, in other words, to optimize thinking for oneself. And they're saying by this time, we've lost the promise of thinking freely. To the point now it's an issue in academia. It's been a conversation for the last 10, 15 years. Where is the open dialogue? Where is the open discourse? Where is the freedom for students to question the stances of their professors? Right? After all, this is a context, one of those rare contexts in which you should be encouraged to question the truths of your professors or theorists or whoever it is that you're reading. That no one is beyond the scope. No matter what is said, none of that should be beyond the scope of critique. I mean, Marx would again, very cynical view. He'd say, whatever idea we're dealing with, it's not an idea, it's an interest. It's a point that I stress in my development of sociological theory course. Marx, with the exception of the theory of historical materialism, Marx didn't like the term idea. What is the idea hiding? The idea hides an interest. So all critiques should be uncover, excavate the interest that's concealed by the idea. And whose interest is an idea? Basically, we create ideas. And we create ideas with interests in mind. So we have to uncover what is the interest underneath the idea that's concealed by the idea. And any time we take an idea at its face value, we're abandoning an important dictate of critical thinking, which is to always scrutinize whatever idea we have in front, just as you're free to scrutinize this. Just as you're free to scrutinize the ideas and the theories of the critical theorists and say, I think they're wrong, or whatever it might be. But that sort of an encouragement of critical thinking should be the aim. The culture industry, back to their argument they're making, the culture industry, they say, poses an ideologically oppositional force. a dialectic to true individuality, geared toward entertaining and pacifying the masses. It fosters conformity. This is their argument. It fosters conformity and mass deception. So first, I distilled it to three main points. I wouldn't be so cruel as to assign the book. I remember I took a sociology of culture class one time as a graduate student, and part of the reading was to read the dialectic of enlightenment. It's a cruel thing to do to your students, because it's not easy reading, of course. It's loaded. But we'll get to just three main ideas that they make. Two, as it relates to the nature, what they would say is the nature of the culture industry, and then really most importantly, what they think the effect of exposure to the culture industry does to one's mind. First argument they make is the content of the culture industry is not art. If it existed, if it's part of the popular cultural landscape, they would say that is not art. That's entertainment. Their view of art is that art should elevate. Art should engage and it should elevate, and there should be some degree of complexity in the relationship between you and the art that you're trying to understand. They would say all popular culture ultimately serves to entertain. And entertainment is very different than, say, challenging the mind of the person who's consuming the art. Movies and radio no longer pretend to be art. The truth that they are just business is made into an ideology in order to justify the rubbish they deliberately produce. They call themselves industries. The entertainment industry, which consists of economic and commercial activities. So they're saying, first and foremost, let's not fool ourselves and call the commodities of popular culture art. It's not art. It's commodity. It simply exists to drive profit. And the way in which it impacts, one of the impacts it has on individuals, is that it's simply there to entertain. It is not there to elevate. It's there to entertain. So that you could hear them, you can imagine them saying something like, every time you watch a Will Ferrell movie, you get a little dumber. They even have a movie, it's called Dumb and Dumber. Right? And then they have a sequel to the Dumb and Dumber movie. This is the embracing of the stupidity of American popular culture. It's seen as a virtue. Hey, I've got this great idea. Let's call the movie Dumb and Dumber, and millions of people will watch it. The culture industry remains the entertainment business. Its influence over the consumers is established by entertainment. Art is not that. True art does not entertain. True art is serious. True art is serious stuff. This, popular culture, is simply entertainment. And it serves as a massive distraction. It's a deflection. It's a way of not dealing with your problems. It's, I'm going to go home and I'm going to veg out for 5 hours on TikTok. You're not engaging, you're not improving yourself, you're not elevating yourself, you're not dealing with the problems in your life, you're not addressing them, you're not helping deal with the problems in a society, you're just checking out. Because you say, well, I'm entitled to entertain myself. Well, somebody's profiting from that. This massive act of deflection. The culture industry can pride itself on the transposition of art into the sphere of consumption. The second criticism they make is that cultural products are homogeneous. You've seen one of these DC, Marvel and DC comic, it's sort of like, here we go, we have enough. Joker, the sequel. Has anybody seen the sequel? Has anybody seen it? It's supposed to be a musical, right? But it's a sequel. Like another one of these sequels, another one of these DC Marvel comic characters. You've seen one, you've seen them all, is what they would say. It's all uniform, it's all identical, it's all formulaic, and in fact, consumers are typically drawn to a genre of, say, film precisely because it is uniform, because it's identical, because it's formulaic. It's going to have a certain, that everybody in the genre of romantic comedies, the idea is it's supposed to have a happy ending. That's also what gets people to watch the romantic comedy in the first place. It's the knowledge that it's going to have a happy ending. Culture now impresses the same stamp on everything. Films, radio, and magazines make up a system which is uniform as the whole in every part. I remember even back when I grew up in the 90s, and I remember Kurt Cobain was saying, like, they were asking about songwriting, how he writes the songs. He's like, well, there's a verse, then there's a chorus, and there's a verse, and there's a chorus, then there's a solo, and then there's a chorus. He was poking fun. I thought that was great of him. He was poking fun at the convention of rock music. Like, this is how you write a rock song. It's really easy. It's very formulaic. This is how it works. And that's what he was making fun of. I don't know if he had any exposure to it. I doubt it, to the Frankfurt School theorists. But he was sort of poking fun at the way in which his own music was formulaic. And the fact is, all those songs were formulaic, and they all had a sound, a particular sound. It involved a certain amount of distortion or fuzz and whatever it was, and then that made up the genre. It was the homogeneity of it, the fact that it was uniform, and you could call this grunge music because it had a uniform sound. But conflict theorists or critical theorists would criticize that and say it's all just conformity. Of course, you have all these bands, the sound is converging to the same uniform, homogeneous sound because that's what's selling at that time. And that's what people are buying. So under monopoly, all mass culture is identical. Hit song structures, as I was just talking about, movie storylines, and TV shows are invariable in form, meaning they do not change, and they are full of ready-made cliches. As soon as a film begins, it is quite clear how it will end, who will be rewarded, punished, or forgotten, they write. It's a foregone conclusion. We already know. It's a formula. What's the concern? The concern is there's no individual thinking. There's no originality of thought. It's just the same rubbish, formulaic rubbish that's produced over and over again, which they say leads and it desensitizes people to the process of conformity. So that poster to the left is the original poster from what would that have been, 1970 something, 1977, and then you had Star Wars: The Force Awakens. And I remember I saw The Force Awakens in theaters, and I myself and others were really excited about this. And about 10 minutes into this movie, I thought, I think I've seen this movie before. And I was just bummed out the whole rest of the movie because I'm like, okay, the characters are different, but this is the same storyline. And I just felt totally gypped. And then I came across this article a few years ago, plagiarizing Star Wars. The new leads in Episode 7 are interesting enough, but the film's main problem is that it never provides them with a worthy original story to justify going back to this universe. I usually have no problem with sequels following certain formulas from its predecessors, but The Force Awakens in 2015 is more like a remake of A New Hope from 1977. And in many instances, it feels as if we're basically watching the same movie. It's the same junk over and over and over and over again. Where is the originality in it? Where are these minds that are free thinkers that produce something new and original and different? horticulture industry doesn't always reward that. And I'll get to this on Thursday. It rewards the minimization of risk, right? Which often means just going with the, going along with the script. Okay. See you Thursday.